I learned the truth about my husband's family the moment they told me I did not belong in the front row at his funeral. The church was quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound feel too loud. My black heels clicked against the polished stone floor, and for a second, every head seemed to turn toward me. I was holding a small bouquet of white lilies, the same flowers Richard used to bring home every anniversary, even when he was exhausted from work and pretending he had not forgotten the date until the last minute. The casket was at the front of the sanctuary, covered in soft white roses, with a framed photo of him smiling beside it. He looked calm in that picture, healthier than he had been in his final months, and I almost stopped walking because my chest tightened so hard I could barely breathe. I had spent 18 years as Emily Carter, Richard Carter's wife. I had sat beside his hospital bed through long nights, counted his pills, held his hand when the machines beeped, and listened when his voice became too weak to finish a sentence. So when I stepped toward the first row, I was not thinking about status or money or family politics. I was only thinking that the seat closest to him was where a wife should be. But before I could sit down, Margaret Carter rose from the front pew like she had been waiting for this exact moment. She was dressed in a tailored black suit, pearls at her throat, silver hair pinned so perfectly it looked untouched by grief. Her eyes moved over me slowly, from my simple black dress to the wedding ring still on my left hand, and then she leaned close enough that only the first few rows could hear her. "Emily," she said, her voice soft but sharp, "the front row is for real family. You should sit in the back." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. I looked past her at Daniel, Richard's older brother, sitting stiffly with his hands folded like he owned the room. I looked at Victoria, Richard's sister, who lowered her eyes to the funeral program but could not hide the small satisfied curve at the corner of her mouth. No one corrected Margaret. No one made room. No one said. She was his wife. The pastor paused near the pulpit. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the third row whispered, and the sound traveled through the church like paper tearing. My fingers tightened around the lily stems until one of them bent, but I did not argue. Richard had once told me that some people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe you have no power left. I had not understood how painful that sentence could be until I stood there beside his casket and watched his family erase me in front of everyone who had come to mourn him. Margaret gave a polite nod toward the back of the church, as if she were assigning a stranger to an overflow seat. "Please," she added, though there was nothing kind in the word. I looked at Richard's photograph again. His smile seemed almost apologetic, as if he already knew this would happen. And maybe he did. Maybe that was why, in the last week of his life, he had squeezed my hand and told me, "No matter what they do, Emily, wait until the right moment." So I lowered my eyes, turned away from the front row, and walked down the center aisle toward the very back of the sanctuary. Every step felt longer than the last. I could feel people watching me with pity, curiosity, and the awkward relief of those who were glad the humiliation had not happened to them. I sat alone in the last pew, nearly 40 feet from my husband's casket, with my bouquet resting in my lap and my heart breaking in a room full of people. Up front, Margaret smoothed her jacket and sat down like order had been restored. Victoria crossed one leg over the other and whispered something to Daniel. The service began, but I barely heard the opening prayer. All I could see was the empty space beside Richard's casket where I should have been. All I could feel was the cold wood of the back pew beneath my hands. And all I could think was that Richard had been right about them. They had waited until he was gone to show me exactly who they were. What they did not know was that Richard had been waiting too. From the last pew, I opened the funeral program with hands that were steadier than I felt. The paper was thick and expensive, cream-colored with Richard's name embossed in dark gray across the front, the kind of detail his family loved because it made grief look elegant. For one brief second, I expected to see the life we had built together printed there, even if only in one small line. Beloved husband of Emily Carter. Loving partner. Devoted wife by his side. Something. Anything. But as my eyes moved down the page, I felt a colder pain settle over me than the one Margaret had already caused. My name was not there. Not once. The program listed Richard as a son, a brother, an uncle, a visionary businessman, and the proud heir of the Carter family legacy. It mentioned his father, who had passed years earlier. It mentioned Margaret's charity work. It mentioned Daniel's role in the company and Victoria's devotion to preserving the family name. But there was no mention of his wife. There was no photograph from our wedding in Vermont, where Richard had cried before I even reached the end of the aisle. There was no picture of the small lake house in Maine where we spent every 4th of July. There was no image from the hospital garden where I pushed him in a wheelchair 3 weeks before he died because he wanted to feel sunlight on his face one more time. Instead, every photograph had been chosen from before me, or around me, or carefully cropped so I did not exist. There was Richard as a young man standing beside Daniel in matching navy suits. Richard beside Victoria at a charity gala. Richard beside Margaret in front of the Carter estate, both of them smiling as if the world had always belonged to them. I turned the pages slowly, each one feeling like another small door closing on 18 years of my life. Up front, Victoria leaned toward an older woman in pearls and whispered with the practiced sadness of someone who wanted to be watched while grieving. She had planned this. I knew it immediately. Victoria had always believed history belonged to whoever arranged the pictures. Years ago, at a Thanksgiving dinner in the Carter mansion, she had told me that family stories should be protected from outsiders. Richard had heard her and placed his hand over mine beneath the table. Later that night, he apologized, but I told him I was used to it. That was the first lie I ever told to keep peace in his family. There had been many more after that. I lied when Margaret introduced me as Richard's wife but not quite one of us. I lied when Daniel asked if I understood how difficult it was to manage a company of that size, as if I had not helped Richard review reports at 2 in the morning while he recovered from surgery. I lied when Victoria stopped inviting me to family meetings and said it was only business. I kept smiling because Richard was tired, because his illness had already taken enough from him, because I thought silence was kindness. But sitting in that last pew, looking at a program that erased me from my own husband's life, I realized my silence had taught them they could take more. The pastor began speaking about Richard's generosity, his discipline, his devotion to family, and I watched Margaret dab the corner of one eye with a folded handkerchief. Daniel kept his face still, but his gaze moved across the room like he was counting investors instead of mourners. Victoria held her program perfectly angled, making sure everyone could see the tribute she had designed. They had turned the funeral into a polished version of a truth they preferred, one where Richard belonged only to them and I was nothing more than a temporary chapter they could close. I looked down at my wedding ring and remembered Richard's final week, when his voice had become thin but his eyes remained clear. He had asked me whether Margaret had been kind. I had said yes. He had asked whether Daniel had pressured me about the house. I had said no. He had asked whether Victoria had tried to remove me from anything important. I had looked away. Richard had squeezed my hand then, weak but firm, and whispered, "Emily, I know my family." Now, as the first hymn filled the church and the sound rose toward the high wooden ceiling, I finally understood the weight of those words. They were not just grieving him. They were trying to own him. They were trying to decide what his life meant, who mattered in it, and who could be pushed to the back when the story became inconvenient. I sat there with the program open in my lap, my name missing from every page, and I made myself stay still. Not because I was defeated. Not because I agreed. But because Richard had asked me to wait for the right moment, and for the first time since he died, I felt certain that moment was getting closer. By the time the second hymn ended, I understood that what happened at the front pew had not been an accident caused by grief. It had been planned with the same careful precision as the flowers, the seating chart, and the glossy program that had removed me from Richard's life. From the back of the church, I could see everything more clearly than they probably imagined. Daniel Carter sat with his shoulders squared, wearing the same dark charcoal suit he wore to board meetings, his face composed in the way men look when they believe the room already belongs to them. Victoria sat beside him, one hand resting over her pearls, her eyes moving from guest to guest as if she were measuring who had noticed her performance. Margaret sat closest to the aisle, perfectly still, the grieving mother in the place of honor, while I sat almost 40 feet behind them like a distant acquaintance who had arrived too late. The pastor continued speaking about Richard's dedication to family, and I almost laughed at the cruelty of the word. Family. For years, the Carters had used that word like a locked gate. It opened for blood, money, and history, but never for loyalty, never for sacrifice, and certainly never for the woman who had stood beside Richard when his powerful name could not make his illness disappear. I lowered my eyes to the program again, but my attention shifted when Daniel leaned toward Victoria. They were careful, but not careful enough. The church was quiet, and sound carried beneath the high wooden ceiling. After this, we deal with Emily, Daniel murmured. Victoria did not look surprised. She simply tilted her head slightly and whispered back, Mother already spoke to the estate attorney. She should be out of the house by next Friday. My breath stopped for 1 second, then returned slowly. The house. The Carter estate in Westchester, with its long gravel driveway, white columns, and cold rooms filled with portraits of people who had never smiled at me. They thought they could send me away from the home where I had cared for Richard through the hardest months of his life. They thought I would pack my clothes into a few boxes, leave behind his books, his watch on the dresser, the blue coffee mug he used every morning, and disappear before their next family dinner. Victoria continued, her voice lower but still clear enough for me to hear. She has no children with him. No real claim. A settlement will keep her quiet. Daniel gave a small nod. We cannot let her interfere with the company transition. There it was. Not grief. Not memory. Not love. The company. Carter Holdings had always been the altar they truly worshipped at. Richard had built it into something stronger than what he inherited, but Daniel had spent years waiting for the moment he could step into the center of it. He had already started speaking like the decision had been made. Temporary chairman. Family representative. Natural successor. Words dressed up to hide hunger. I remembered the last month in the hospital, when Daniel visited for 12 minutes and spent 9 of them asking Richard whether certain voting shares had been clarified. I remembered Victoria arriving with flowers and leaving with questions about the family foundation. I remembered Margaret sitting beside Richard's bed and telling him he needed to think about protecting the Carter name, while he stared at the ceiling with exhaustion in his eyes. They had not waited for him to die before reaching for what he had. They had only waited to stop pretending. The pastor invited Victoria to come forward for a family remembrance, and she rose gracefully, smoothing the front of her black dress. She walked to the microphone with a folded paper in her hand, passing Richard's casket without touching it. My brother belonged to a family with deep roots, she began, her voice trembling just enough to sound sincere. He understood duty, legacy, and the importance of preserving what generations before us built. I listened as she spoke for nearly 10 minutes about the Carter name, the Carter foundation, the Carter traditions, and the Carter future. She never said he loved me. She never said I loved him. She never said that in the final days, when Richard could barely lift a glass of water, he still asked whether I had eaten. Instead, she turned him into a monument they could control. Near the end, she looked toward the back of the church, and for the first time that morning, our eyes met. There was no sadness in her face. Only warning. She thought the service was the beginning of my removal. She thought the front row, the program, the speech, and the whispered plans were all pieces of the same quiet victory. I sat still, my hands folded over the missing version of my life printed in cream-colored paper. I did not stand. I did not speak. I did not correct her. Because beneath the humiliation, beneath the grief, beneath the cold certainty that they intended to erase me completely, another memory rose in my mind. Richard in his hospital bed, pale but focused, asking me to listen carefully. When they think they have won, he had whispered, that is when Howard will come. Victoria was still at the microphone when the side door near the vestibule opened with a quiet creak that somehow cut through every polished word she was saying. At first, only a few people noticed. A man in the last row turned his head. Then a woman near the aisle glanced back, her pearl earrings catching the soft church light. I did not move, but my heart began to beat differently, not faster exactly, just heavier, as if it recognized something before my mind allowed me to. An older man stepped inside wearing a dark grey overcoat over a navy suit, his white hair neatly combed, his posture straight despite the silver cane in his left hand. In his right hand, he carried a black leather folder. Howard Bennett. Richard's private attorney. Not the estate lawyer Margaret liked to mention at dinners, not the corporate attorney Daniel called whenever he wanted something approved, but Howard Bennett, the only man Richard trusted with matters he never discussed in front of his family. I had met him many times, though never in the Carter mansion and never at family gatherings. Howard came to the hospital after visiting hours. Howard called from blocked numbers. Howard spoke to Richard in a calm, measured voice and always looked me in the eye when he left, as if he knew I was carrying more than grief. Victoria paused for half a second when she saw him, then forced herself to continue. Richard believed that legacy was not merely inherited, she said, but her voice had lost its smooth confidence. Daniel noticed the change and turned. The moment he saw Howard, his jaw tightened. Margaret looked back next, and for the first time that morning, something slipped through her perfect expression. Not sorrow. Not surprise. Fear. Howard did not walk toward the front row. He did not nod to Margaret. He did not greet Daniel or Victoria. He moved slowly down the side aisle, past the floral arrangements, past the guests who were now watching him instead of Victoria, and came directly to the last pew where I sat alone. Every whisper in the church seemed to fade under the sound of his cane touching the floor. Tap! 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 When he reached me, he stopped, removed his overcoat, and gave a small, respectful bow. Mrs. Carter, he said clearly, not loudly, but clearly enough for the nearest rows to hear. Mrs. Carter. 2 simple words, and yet they landed harder than anything Victoria had said from the pulpit. I looked up at him, and for a moment, I could not speak. His eyes were kind, but serious. He knew what they had done. He had seen where I was sitting. He had seen the program in my lap with my name missing from it. He had seen the front row filled with people who believed they had already won. Mr. Bennett, I said, my voice low. He opened the black leather folder and removed a sealed black envelope. It was thick, formal, and unmistakably expensive, with Richard's handwriting across the front in silver ink. My breath caught when I saw the words. To be opened only when they make Emily sit behind everyone else. The sentence blurred for a second because my eyes filled before I could stop them. Richard had known. He had known exactly what they would do, exactly how they would choose pride over decency, exactly how they would try to make me small in the one room where I should have been honored as his wife. Howard held the envelope with both hands, as if it were something sacred. He asked me to wait until the condition was met, he said softly. I am sorry that it was. Up front, Victoria had stopped speaking completely. The microphone picked up the faint sound of her breathing before she stepped back from it. Daniel stood halfway, then sat again when several guests looked at him. Margaret's hand moved to the pearls at her throat. The pastor, confused but composed, walked down from the pulpit and approached Howard with the careful dignity of a man who understood that grief sometimes brings unfinished business into holy places. Mr. Bennett, he said, is this part of Mr. Carter's final wishes? Howard turned toward him. Yes, Reverend. Mr. Carter left explicit instructions that this envelope be delivered during the service, in the presence of those gathered, if his wife was denied her rightful place. The word wife seemed to move through the church like a bell. I felt it reach the front row. I saw Victoria lower her paper. I saw Daniel look at Margaret as if silently asking whether she had known. Margaret did not look back at him. She was staring at the envelope. The pastor hesitated, then looked at me. For the first time since I had entered the church, someone at the front of the room waited for my permission. My hands were cold around the funeral program, but my voice did not shake when I answered. Richard wanted it read, I said. Then it should be read. Howard nodded once, then walked toward the pulpit. No one whispered now. No one moved. Even the air in the church seemed to hold still. I remained in the last pew, exactly where they had put me, while the man carrying Richard's final words stepped into the place where Victoria had tried to erase me. Howard placed the black envelope on the lectern, adjusted the microphone, and looked out over the room. His gaze passed over Margaret, Daniel, and Victoria before returning to me. Then he broke the seal. Howard unfolded the letter slowly, and the sound of the paper seemed louder than the organ music had been. He took a breath, adjusted his glasses, and looked once toward the casket before he began. To everyone gathered here today, he read, if this message is being opened during my funeral, it means my wife, Emily, was treated exactly as I feared she would be. A low movement passed through the church, not quite a gasp, not quite a whisper, but something in between. I kept my eyes on the floor because if I looked at Margaret, Daniel, or Victoria, I was afraid the ache in my chest would become too visible. Howard continued, his voice steady and respectful. I know my family. I know the language they use when they want cruelty to sound like tradition. I know how they hide exclusion behind words like legacy, duty, and propriety. And I know they have never understood the woman who gave me more peace in 18 years than this family gave me in a lifetime. My fingers closed around the edge of the funeral program in my lap. For the first time that morning, the printed pages that had erased me felt powerless. Richard's words were in the room now, and no one could crop me out of them. Howard paused, then reached into the envelope and removed a small silver flash drive attached to a folded note. Mr. Carter also requested that the following recording be played before the rest of the letter is read, he said. The pastor nodded quietly, and one of the church attendants brought a small speaker to the lectern. Daniel stood immediately. This is inappropriate, he said, his voice controlled but sharp. This is a funeral service, not a legal proceeding. Howard did not look intimidated. Mr. Carter anticipated that objection as well. He lifted the folded note. He wrote, if Daniel says this is inappropriate, remind him that asking about voting shares beside my hospital bed was also inappropriate. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear someone shift a purse strap 3 rows ahead of me. Daniel slowly sat down, his face pale with anger he could not show. The attendant connected the device, and a soft click came through the speaker. Then Richard's voice filled the church. It was weaker than I remembered from our younger years, but it was unmistakably his, warm, deliberate, and painfully alive. Emily, he said first, and hearing. My name from him nearly broke me. If you are sitting where I think they made you sit, I am sorry. You deserved the first seat, the first mention, and the first kindness. But if they denied you that, then they have proven why I had to do what I did. I pressed my lips together and stared at his photograph near the casket. Around me, no one moved. Richard continued. In my final months, many people visited me. Some asked about the company. Some asked about accounts. Some asked whether documents had been signed, whether decisions had been made, whether the Carter name would remain protected. But only one person asked if I was comfortable. Only one person noticed when the room was too cold. Only one person stayed after midnight when there was nothing to gain from staying. That person was my wife. A woman near the aisle began to cry quietly. I did not know her name, but I saw her wipe her eyes with the corner of the program, the same program where my name had been removed. Richard's voice softened. Emily did not marry my family. She married me. And because she married me, she endured years of polite insults, closed doors, private meetings, and smiles that disappeared when I turned my head. She told me it did not matter. She told me she was fine. She was lying because she loved me enough not to make my illness heavier. My vision blurred. I remembered his hand in mine, thin and warm, while hospital machines glowed in the dark. I remembered telling him to rest when I knew he was trying to protect me from people who were waiting for him to be gone. So let this be clear, Richard said through the speaker, each word slower now, as if he had saved his strength for this one message. Emily Carter is not an outsider. She is not a guest in my life. She is not someone to be moved to the back of the room for the comfort of people who mistook blood for loyalty. She is my wife, my chosen family, and the only person I trusted when the truth became too heavy to carry alone. Howard lowered his eyes, and even he seemed to need a moment. Up front, Margaret sat frozen, one hand still pressed to her pearls. Victoria's face had lost its careful sadness. Daniel stared straight ahead, but the muscle in his jaw moved again and again. Richard's voice returned for the final line of the recording, quieter than before. "And now, Howard, tell them what I left her, and why." The recording ended with a soft click, but no one breathed normally afterward. The church that had watched me walk to the back in humiliation now sat trapped inside Richard's truth. Howard placed the flash drive beside the envelope, lifted the remaining pages of the letter, and looked toward the front row with the calm expression of a man about to open a door that could not be closed again. Howard turned the next page with the same careful patience, but the room had changed around him. Before Richard's voice played through that speaker, the church had belonged to the Carter family. Their flowers, their program, their front row, their version of grief. Now every eye was fixed on Howard's hands, waiting for the words Richard had saved for the moment they believed I had been pushed out of the story. Richard Carter executed his final estate plan 6 months before his passing, Howard said, no longer reading only as a friend, but speaking with the full authority of the attorney Richard had trusted. He did so after multiple private consultations, 2 independent medical evaluations, and repeated confirmation that he was of sound mind and acting without pressure from any person. Daniel shifted in the front pew. That sentence had been meant for him. I could see it land in the stiff line of his shoulders. Howard continued. Under the terms of that estate plan, the Westchester residence located on Briarwood Lane, including the main house, the guest house, the surrounding 32 acres, and all personal property specifically identified in the attached schedule, was transferred into the sole ownership of Emily Carter prior to Richard's passing. A sharp breath came from somewhere near the front. Margaret's hand dropped from her pearls to the edge of the pew. The house she had planned to remove me from within a week had not been hers to offer, reclaim, or control. I sat in the last row with my hands folded, feeling the strange weight of a truth I had known but had not allowed myself to feel. Richard had signed the papers in the hospital on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I remembered the sound of water against the window, Howard's pen on the clipboard, Richard looking at me afterward and saying, "Home should never be something they can take from you." At the time, I had cried because I thought he was only protecting my shelter. Now I understood he had also been protecting my dignity. Howard turned another page. In addition, Richard transferred his controlling voting interest in Carter Holdings into the Emily Carter Trust, effective immediately upon his death. This includes the authority to appoint or remove interim executive leadership, review all major transactions, suspend access to discretionary family accounts connected to company holdings, and initiate a full independent audit of corporate and foundation activity for the preceding 3 fiscal years. The words were clean, legal, and devastating. Daniel stood before he seemed to realize he had done it. "That is impossible," he said, louder than he intended. Several guests turned toward him, and he lowered his voice, but not his anger. Richard would never remove the company from the family. Howard looked at him over the top of his glasses. Mr. Carter was very clear that he was not removing the company from the family. He was placing it with the only person he believed would protect it from entitlement, panic, and misuse. Daniel's face tightened, but there was nowhere for his protest to go. Victoria leaned toward Margaret and whispered something I could not hear, but Margaret did not answer. She was staring forward, her face pale beneath the soft church lights, as if the floor beneath the Carter name had quietly disappeared. Howard continued before anyone could recover. The Carter Family Foundation will also be reviewed by an outside accounting firm chosen by Mrs. Carter. Until that review is complete, no new distributions, salary adjustments, consulting fees, property transfers, or discretionary reimbursements are to be approved without her written consent. Victoria's mouth opened slightly. For years, she had treated the foundation like an extension of her social calendar, a polished place where charity dinners, donor lunches, and elegant committees made her feel important. Now even that had been placed behind a locked door, and I held the key. I did not smile. I did not lift my head in triumph. The truth was, I felt no joy watching them lose what they had assumed was theirs. I felt only the deep ache of realizing how much Richard must have seen, how many quiet conversations he must have overheard, how long he must have carried the knowledge that the people closest to his blood were waiting to divide his life into assets. Howard's voice softened as he read the next line directly from Richard's letter. Emily, I am not leaving these things to you because I want revenge. I am leaving them to you because you know the difference between ownership and stewardship. You know what it means to care for something when no one is applauding you. My eyes burned, but I forced myself to breathe. Around me, the people who had watched my humiliation were no longer looking at the front row with respect. They were looking at the space between Howard and me, trying to understand how power had moved so quietly from the first pew to the last. Margaret finally stood, slow and rigid. Howard, she said, her voice trembling beneath its polish, this is not the time. Howard folded the page halfway, then looked at her with measured sadness. Mrs. Carter, Richard chose the time. You chose the condition. The church went completely still. Margaret sat back down as if the words had taken the strength from her knees. Howard placed Richard's letter on the lectern beside the black envelope and looked toward me. Mrs. Carter, he said, your husband also requested that you be invited to take your rightful place before the service continues. For several seconds, I remained seated in the last pew, the same place they had sent me to disappear. Then, one by one, people began to turn around. I felt the first turn before I saw it, the subtle shift of bodies in the pews, the soft rustle of black coats and funeral programs as people looked away from the lectern and back toward me. A few minutes earlier, those same faces had watched me walk to the last row with quiet pity, as if I were a woman being gently removed from a place she had no right to occupy. Now their expressions were different. Some looked embarrassed. Some looked stunned. Some looked at me as if they were seeing me for the first time, not as the widow pushed to the back, not as the quiet wife the Carters had ignored for years, but as the person Richard had trusted with everything they had been trying to claim. I did not stand right away. I let the silence remain where it was. I let Margaret feel it from the front pew. I let Daniel feel it with every investor, cousin, board member, and family friend watching him try to control a room that no longer answered to him. I let Victoria feel it from the microphone where she had just spoken about legacy without once saying my name. My hands rested on the funeral program in my lap, the cream-colored pages still open to a life that had been edited around me. For the first time, those missing words did not hurt as much. Richard had spoken my name aloud in front of everyone. No printed program could erase that. Howard remained at the pulpit, waiting with the patience of a man who had carried this moment for a long time. The pastor stood beside him, his hands folded, his expression solemn but kind. In the front row, Margaret did not turn around. Her back stayed straight, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. She wanted to pretend I was still behind her, still small, still separate from the place where decisions were made. But everyone else had already turned. An older man who had once served on the Carter Holdings board gave me a slow, respectful nod. A woman from Richard's charity committee lowered her eyes as if ashamed. Someone near the middle aisle whispered, she was his wife, and the words traveled farther than the person intended. I looked down at my wedding ring, then at the lilies in my lap. One stem was bent from the moment Margaret had told me to move. I smoothed it gently with my thumb, though I knew it would not stand straight again. Some things, once bent, never return to what they were. They become evidence. I rose. Slowly, not because Howard had called me forward, not because the room was finally ready to recognize me, but because Richard had asked me to wait until the right moment, and the right moment had arrived. The wood of the pew creaked softly as I stood. That small sound seemed to pass through the church like a signal. People shifted to make space even though I was nowhere near them. I stepped into the center aisle, and for the first time that morning, I walked toward my husband without being blocked. The distance from the last pew to the front felt longer than 40 feet. It felt like 18 years. Every dinner where Margaret smiled through an insult. Every family meeting Daniel held without telling me. Every holiday photo Victoria arranged so I stood at the edge. Every hospital night when they went home and I stayed. I carried all of it with me, not like anger, but like proof. As I passed the rows, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint echo of my heels against the stone floor and the quiet breathing of people who understood they were witnessing more than a funeral disagreement. This was a correction. This was the moment the story they had arranged began to collapse under the truth Richard had left behind. When I reached the front, Victoria stepped away from the microphone as if the space itself no longer belonged to her. Daniel avoided my eyes. Margaret finally turned her head, slowly, and looked at me with a face I had never seen before. Not the cold superiority she wore at dinners. Not the polite distance she used in public. This was uncertainty. She had spent years believing I would always choose silence because silence was easier, cleaner, more acceptable. And she had been right, for a long time. But my silence had never meant surrender. I stopped beside Richard's casket and placed the white lilies carefully on top of the roses. My hand rested there for a moment, close to his photograph, close to the man who had known his family well enough to prepare for the cruelty they would show when he was gone. I wanted to cry, but not in front of them. Not yet. Howard stepped down from the pulpit and handed me the black envelope. He wanted you to have this. After the reading, he said softly. I accepted it with both hands. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Margaret's voice came from behind me, low and strained. Emily, we should discuss this privately. I turned toward her then. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just enough for her to see that the woman she had sent to the back row was no longer waiting for permission. No, I said calmly. Richard made this public because you made my humiliation public. The room went still again, but this time, I was not the one being judged. Margaret looked away first. Howard did not let the silence settle for long. He returned to the lectern and lifted one final document from the black leather folder, thinner than the others but sealed with a red tab across the top. The moment Daniel saw it, his expression changed. It was fast, almost invisible, but I caught it because I was standing close enough now to see the color drain from his face. Victoria saw it too, and for the first time all morning, she looked not offended, not embarrassed, but afraid of what might come next. Howard placed the document flat on the lectern. There is one more matter Richard instructed me to disclose today, he said. He believed it should be heard before any private discussion takes place, because privacy has already been used too often in this family to hide things that should have been brought into the light. Margaret's lips pressed together. Howard, she said carefully, you have already made your point. Howard looked at her with the calm sadness of someone who had no desire to be cruel, only honest. No, Mrs. Carter. Richard made his point. I am only honoring it. He turned back to the room. 5 days before Richard passed, my office received a request to prepare an emergency amendment to his estate documents. The request stated that Richard was no longer able to make clear decisions and that certain family representatives needed authority to act on his behalf. A quiet shock moved through the church. I felt it ripple behind me, people shifting, whispering, trying to understand who would have done such a thing while Richard was still alive. My eyes went to Daniel. He was staring at Howard with the rigid focus of a man watching a door close from the wrong side. Victoria whispered, "This is absurd," but her voice was too thin to convince anyone. Howard continued. The request was not approved. Richard had already prepared for that possibility. He had given my office written instructions that no change, transfer, authorization, or medical competency claim involving his estate could proceed unless confirmed directly by him in person or by a recorded statement witnessed by independent counsel. He paused and lifted a small tablet from the folder. On the same day that request was made, Richard recorded this final confirmation. The pastor looked uncomfortable, but he did not stop him. Neither did I. Howard tapped the screen, and Richard's voice returned, weaker than before but still clear enough to silence every breath in the room. "This is Richard Carter," he said. "I am making this statement voluntarily. I understand my estate plan, my company structure, and the decisions I have signed. I do not authorize any person, including my mother, my brother, my sister, or any representative claiming to act for the Carter family, to alter my wishes. If anyone attempts to suggest I am confused or unable to decide, they are not protecting me. They are protecting themselves. The recording stopped there, but the word stayed suspended in the church like smoke no one could wave away. Margaret closed her eyes. Victoria looked down at the funeral program in her lap as if the page had suddenly become interesting. Daniel finally spoke, and his voice was lower than before. A business family has to prepare for emergencies. Howard nodded once. That is true. But this was not filed as a business emergency. It was filed as a request to remove Emily Carter from decision-making authority before Richard's death certificate had even been issued. A woman in the second row covered her mouth. Someone near the back whispered, "Before he died." I stood beside Richard's casket, my hand still resting on the black envelope, and felt something inside me become very still. I had known they disliked me. I had known they wanted me gone. But hearing that someone had tried to move against me while Richard was still lying in a hospital bed changed the shape of my grief. It gave it edges. Howard looked at me then, and his voice softened. "Mrs. Carter, Richard did not want accusations made without review. That is why he authorized you to begin an independent audit, not only of Carter Holdings, but of any family office transactions connected to the attempted amendment." Daniel stepped out from the pew. "Emily, this is getting out of hand." It was the first time he had used my name that day. Not Mrs. Carter. Not Richard's wife. Emily, spoken like a warning dressed as concern. I turned to him slowly. "No, Daniel," I said. "This got out of hand when you thought grief made me powerless." His mouth tightened, but he said nothing. I looked at Margaret, then Victoria, then at the room full of people who had watched them place me in the back row as if I were someone to be managed. "Richard did not leave me control so I could humiliate anyone," I said. "He left it to me because he knew the truth would need protection." Howard closed the folder. The sound was soft, but final. In that moment, I understood that the funeral had stopped being only a farewell. It had become the first hearing in a trial no court had yet scheduled, and every person in the front row knew there were records waiting outside that church with their names on them. The service never returned to what it had been before Howard opened the black envelope. The pastor offered a closing prayer, but even his gentle voice could not smooth the sharp edges Richard had left behind. People bowed their heads, yet no one seemed fully focused on the words. They were thinking about the recording, the attempted amendment, the house, the company, the audit, and the woman who had been sent to the last pew before being handed the keys to everything the Carter family had tried to guard. I stood beside Richard's casket through the final prayer, my hand resting lightly on the white roses, not because I wanted the room to see me there, but because I needed one last quiet moment with him before the world outside those church doors changed forever. When the prayer ended, no one rushed to speak. The organist began playing softly, and guests started leaving in careful silence, their footsteps slow, their whispers restrained. Some looked at me with sympathy. Others looked at Margaret, Daniel, and Victoria with the uncomfortable curiosity people reserve for families whose secrets have become public in the worst possible place. Margaret remained seated for several seconds, her face turned forward, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles looked pale. Victoria gathered the funeral programs from the front pew as if removing them quickly could undo what they had failed to include. Daniel stepped into the aisle and spoke quietly to a man I recognized from the Carter Holdings board, but the man only nodded once and walked away without shaking his hand. That small gesture said more than any argument could have. Outside, the late afternoon air was cold and bright. The church stood on a hill overlooking a quiet road lined with bare trees, and the black cars waiting along the curb looked polished enough to reflect the grey sky. I paused at the top of the stone steps, still holding Richard's black envelope in one hand and my gloves in the other. Howard came to stand beside me, his cane resting against the step. "You handled that with more grace than most people would have," he said. I looked out at the parking lot, where Margaret, Daniel, and Victoria stood near a waiting sedan, no longer surrounded by admirers, no longer protected by the illusion that the day belonged only to them. "Grace was never the hard part," I said. "Pretending not to see what they were doing was." Howard nodded, then opened his folder and removed a smaller sealed packet. "Richard wanted you to receive this after the service, privately. It contains the preliminary list of accounts, board actions, foundation payments, and property transfers he believed should be reviewed first." I took the packet, feeling its weight settle into my palm like the beginning of a responsibility I had not asked for but would not refuse. "Did he know who made the request to change the documents?" I asked. Howard looked toward the Carter family car before answering. He had suspicions. He did not want me to accuse anyone without records. I almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. That sounded like Richard. Fair even when hurt. Careful even when betrayed. Loving enough to protect me, but disciplined enough to let the truth prove itself. Margaret finally approached, with Daniel and Victoria a few steps behind her. She seemed smaller outside the church, away from the front pew, away from the flowers and the program and the version of the day she had arranged. "Emily," she said, her voice quieter than before, "whatever Richard signed, we are still a family. We should not let outsiders turn us against one another." I looked at Howard, then back at her. "Howard is not the outsider here," I said. Victoria's face tightened, but she said nothing. Daniel tried a different tone, softer, almost reasonable. "An audit will damage the company. It will create questions, headlines, instability. Richard would not have wanted that." I stepped down one stone step, close enough that he had to meet my eyes. Richard wanted the truth protected. If the company is strong, the audit will prove it. If it is not, then the problem is not the audit. For the first time in all the years I had known him, Daniel had no polished answer ready. I turned to Margaret. "I am not removing anyone today. I am not making a scene at Richard's funeral. But starting tomorrow morning, every account, every transfer, every foundation expense, and every document connected to that attempted amendment will be reviewed." Margaret swallowed. Victoria looked toward the car. Daniel stared at me with a kind of disbelief that almost looked like fear. I put on my black gloves slowly, then held Richard's envelope against my chest. "You told me to sit in the back because you thought that was where Richard left me," I said. "But he did not leave me in the back. He left me with the truth." I walked past them toward Howard's car, not quickly, not triumphantly, but steadily. Behind me, the church bells began to ring, soft and measured over the quiet hill. I did not look back until I reached the curb. Margaret, Daniel, and Victoria were still standing together, but they no longer looked like a family in control. They looked like people waiting for a door to open, afraid of what might be found behind it. Howard opened the car door for me and asked, "Where would you like to begin, Mrs. Carter?" I looked down at the sealed packet Richard had left behind, then toward the road leading away from the church. "With the first name on the list," I said. And as the car pulled away, I understood that Richard's funeral had not ended my place in his story. It had revealed why he had trusted me to finish it.